I just wanted to kind of do a little bit of a recap. So this year we focused our community of practice meetings on land-based learning. So back in November, for those of you might have participated, we recorded a conversation where we heard from 3 educators and learned about what they're doing in their own land-based practices. And then in March, we heard from 2 educators about how to incorporate Indigenous plants into teaching gardens. So we wanted to finish off the year with learning about how to weave Indigenous knowledge into curriculum. And even if you're not a teacher, I think this is going to be a really nice way to think about how do we create meaningful experiences. It's not enough to get outside. It's not enough to just learn some plant names. We need to think really deeply about how we can incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into the land-based knowledge that we have. So we're really excited about to hear about the new resource that's been created today. So if you weren't able to join our other sessions, they're all on our website if you'd like to go back. So to introduce a little bit of the presentation today, and it varies all over Canada, but here in BC, we have these wonderful First Peoples principles of learning, and that's what the curriculum is kind of based on. And thinking about how our curriculum for K-12 students, how they weave Indigenous ways of knowing and learning throughout each of our subjects. It's not, okay, you're taking a First Nations class or anything. It's woven throughout how we teach every subject, whether it's science or English or math or social studies. And these principles of learning really focus educators on how to teach those subjects and how to think about Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge. So it really focuses the learner on the learner, building relationships, offering different ways to demonstrate learning, and really deeply honoring Indigenous knowledge. And what I really love as a teacher about these principles is that they apply to all learners. They're going to benefit everyone. If you're focusing on relationships, if you start off the day and you haven't checked in with the people who are in the room, it's going to be a really different session and probably a bit more, a bit less focused than if we greet them in the morning. Even all the children that we all deal with, if you give them a good morning and a really nice hug, we're creating those relationships. We're going to be able to have better experiences through our learning. So yeah, I love these principles of learning, and the more I use them, the more rich I think they are. So yeah. So we would like to introduce our speaker. So Dr. Gillian Judson is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University here in BC, and her scholarship looks at imagination's role in leadership and eco-learning. So thank you so much, Jillian, for joining us today. We're also going to be joined by Megan Sandham, who's a primary learning coordinator in the Delta School District and a graduate student in imaginative education, which sounds so fun. I can't wait to hear from both of you today. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, to be part of the community for this afternoon, and to be here especially with Megan. Megan is in fact finishing off her master's this summer, and she doesn't look stressed, does she? No. Yeah, so thank you for bringing up the imaginative education. This is part of the story of the resource I'm going to share today. There's a few pieces coming together here. One is this notion of a walking curriculum, and it's based on principles of using imagination to engage us with the land through exploratory walks. And that's really aligned with ImagineEd. And if you've never been to ImagineEd, it's a blog with all kinds of imagination focused practice, educationthatinspires.ca. But the story behind the Walking Forward resource, and maybe we could flip to the next slide, please. It goes back, perfect. It goes back to a master's program, because the person that I co-authored this work with, her name is Heidi Wood. I wish she could be here today. She's a wonderful human. She's a wonderful teacher. She's taught me many things, but I guess technically I was originally her teacher. She did a master's degree in imaginative education many years ago. And then since that time, we've been really connecting, and we're both very passionate about bringing Indigenous ways of knowing and being into schools and practice, but we're also both equally committed to the role of imagination in learning. If we could change the slide, please. So what happened was, and oh, there we go. It goes back to a coffee, going over coffee, having a conversation about, the walking curriculum. I'm very happy with the work. It comes out of a theory called imaginative ecological education. But as a white settler, somebody who's well-versed in Western ways of knowing and being, it isn't a representation of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And she said, and she felt that we could work together and work with educators to explore how those walks could be reframed in ways that help us teach Indigenous ways of knowing and being and the principles of learning. So our journey began with a passion for imagination and a desire to use tools of imagination to help educators connect with the land. And so there's themes of imagination and Indigenous ways of knowing and being and wellness of the planet and wellness of ourselves that interweave in this document. Could change the slide, please. And so we started it as an inquiry project. There's 14 educators involved from 7 different schools across the Surrey School District, and 175 youth learners were a part of the process. The teachers and educators involved were part of a workshop series where we began to investigate imaginative and ecological practices together. And the 3 pieces that are really interwoven in the Walking Forward resource would be, first of all, First Peoples Principles of Learning. Things like learning involves recognition of the consequences of one's action. How do we teach that in a way that engages emotion and imagination? And we realize there are certain walks in the walking curriculum theme that really emotionally connect students with that way of understanding this principle. And so we brought the First Peoples Principles together with, I'm jumping to the third, with principles of imaginative ecological education. And the educators involved engaged in spirals of inquiry. They each took a small inquiry with their students over a school year. And this spiral is one you can find, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, through NOI, which is the network of inquiry in Indigenous education. All of these links are in the resource, and I know that Addie and Genevieve will be providing you with that link, but these are the 3 weaving pieces. First Peoples Principles of Learning, a spiral of inquiry. So we know that great transformation happens when teachers are curious and when their own interests are being fed and fueled. So the idea of how do we incorporate First Peoples of Principles in learning? How do we do it in ways that are meaningful? And from my research and practice, I know well that the moments our students are most interested and most engaged, their emotions and imaginations are involved in the learning. So I agree completely. Going outside is not necessarily enough. We need to use tools of the imagination to connect with place and land. And so that's what we did. We used imaginative tools from an approach called imaginative ecological education and the walking curriculum to really engage students with First Peoples Principles of Learning. And what the results of this resource is the resource called Walking Forward. And if you look at the resource, it begins with our story and where we begin. It then talks about the roots of the work we're doing, gives you a little bit more information about imaginative ecological education, about the First Peoples Principles, about the spirals of inquiry. And then the real meat of the work comes, and it's the reflections of the teachers. Each of their inquiry reflections are included with a walk that helped and that's reframed to support a particular way First People principle. And we called that Out on the Land. So now that we're looking at the teacher's experience, how can we actually go out on the land ourselves using a walking focus theme that's been reframed in an Indigenous way? And yes, it will be translated soon in French, very exciting. This is the Walking Forward resource. The walking curriculum is already in French, if that's of interest to you. And there's a supporting website. If you want to look at the back of the new resource, you'll see a lot of those activities listed and lots of resources available. And so one thing we wanted to do, Heidi and I, before we shared it with the world, was we led a small professional learning community in looking at each of the First Peoples Principles and all the walks that we've framed. And that's where Megan comes in. So Megan is particularly well suited to speak to this because she's somebody that's studying imaginative pedagogy. She is also someone that was using the walking curriculum for quite a few years. and now is using the Walking Forward resource. So over to Megan to speak to some of her experiences using some of these walks that have been reframed in Indigenous ways.
Thanks, Jillian. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you today. Yeah, so a little bit of background. Just as Jillian said, I started using, I heard about a walking curriculum in 2019. And like many teachers do, I grabbed it, I skimmed it, and I started taking my kids outside. And it was a new experience for me. I had already taken my kids out a lot, but it was to play on the playground. And I was looking for something a bit more focused and looking for something that explored our space a little bit more than just the playground. So I started taking them out, and I would look at the titles of the walks, and I would kind of just interpret them in my own way. And the walks were fine. They were fine. We were outside. We weren't on the playground. It was fine. Then I started my master's in imaginative education, and one of the required readings was a walking curriculum, so I had to read it. And reading it from cover to cover, plus having that understanding of what imaginative education is and what cognitive tools are, I started to do those very same walks that I had done previously in a very different way. And they became so much better. The kids were more engaged. It felt like the learning was going deeper. It was just a whole different experience. Then I started using this Walking Forward resource, and again, it took me to another level. Being able to think, I think for me, the shift really came from thinking about place as not just being the actual physical space that we were outside in. So we started out just, on these human-made playgrounds, and then we started to look at our space, but we were still looking at it from a very Western perspective and kind of what can this place do for me? And then this new resource has shifted that in thinking about place not as just the physical space, but as language and culture and story and history and memory and all of those things. And I love that this resource has a story attached to a classroom's experience. Because it just kind of gives you an idea of where you could go with this. And then it has an Indigenous connection, which is so helpful, and it has it for some local communities. So I did the Feeling Rooted walk 3 different times with 3 different classes. And each time it was different, but each time it was really, really deep. And the kids, the kinds of ideas that came from me, first of all, sharing some background, some Indigenous connections about, so for roots, we talked about how Indigenous peoples in the past used roots, how they continue to use roots today, the way in which they harvest them. The kids were super interested in knowing that there's ways that they can harvest roots without killing the plants that they're taking them from. And so that whole thing was super interesting to them and just the different ways they could use them. But then when we talked about the cognitive tool, like metaphor, what does it mean to feel rooted? I had used that in the past with a walking curriculum, and the kids kind of said they had some general ideas about feeling rooted. Like it means that I'm tied to a place. But when I did it using Walking Forward and having talked about the Indigenous connection, the kinds of things that kids were saying, I wrote them down because they were so beautiful. So they said, and I should say that these were grade 3 students and grade 2 students, so not very old. A lot of people might think, these kids, they don't have a lot of things to say about abstract ideas. Totally wrong. So one of the students said, a root is your heart because it connects to your whole body. Someone else said a root can also be something you know is your home. Roots go to where they started, like salmon. And feeling rooted is a good feeling because people take care of you. So I don't think that those ideas would have come without talking about place in its entirety, that it's not just It's not just the physical space that we're in, but it's all of those other things that make it up. And that's where I think the richness really lies in this resource.
It's just always so great to hear from the educators using these resources. So that's our brief introduction to the Walking Forward resource. And we would welcome any comments or questions or thoughts about that as well.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And I was so happy to hear all the, I'm not sure how we say that, the testimony of the young about how to feel, what is it to feel roots. It's like so amazing that they are thinking that way, like in filling me with hope. And I think we got a question in the in the chat box from Francis, who is asking, being present in nature takes time. How will that fit within the school schedule?
Oh, brilliant question. My work in the role of imagination stems from an observation that was then supported by research that very few children in mainstream schools have any sense of connection to place. They have really a strong emotional disaffection with the natural world. It's certainly what I observed in my own teaching. So the roots of imaginative ecological education are really, how do we develop emotional connections with place? How do we do that in urban and suburban environments? And so I agree with the question. It doesn't happen overnight, but by taking an imaginative and an ecological approach, which really attempts to develop an emotional connection with particular places in the natural world around schools and in schoolyards, we can make that happen by bringing kids outside, not as a break from learning, but as a full-on extension of their learning more routinely. Does this happen quickly? Does it require a different mindset? Does it require patience and time? All of these things, which are also teachings of First Peoples principles. We have a sort of a fast food version of schooling and education, and I'm sure you've heard of the slow food movement. Well, there's also the slow education movement. So I think with time, I know for myself, imagine if starting in kindergarten, every child learned part of their language arts and their science and their social studies, all these topics that we disconnect in schools, but are really completely connected. What if all of that learning happened out on the land for some of the time? And they did the same thing in grade 1 and grade 2 and grade 3 and grade 4. By grade 10, they wouldn't find it odd that they're learning these topics outside. So it's a transition, it's a different mindset, it's a different disposition, but I firmly believe we can all start baby steps.
A really nice reminder, Jillian. I think it's so important, but it's not too late, right? Like if people are, they haven't had it in kindergarten, we can introduce it, you know, whatever age folks are.
It is difficult. Grade 10, like if you're starting this with grade 10 students and it is happening, we do have the educators that say, well, they don't take it seriously. And I think to myself, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised they don't take it seriously, because it's not the way they've been schooled to think of school. And that's the work that we're all trying to do, I think. We want to really transform what we understand learning to be about. And it's people like Megan Sandham, shout out to Megan there, who does all of her teaching outdoors. And all of her teaching is connected to land and growth and gardens, really moving away from what we tend to think of school to be about. So it takes time, it takes patience, and that's why it's nice to have a community of people to support you, because there will be some parents who question why they're going outside. They should be inside learning, and we have to switch the mindset that there's no learning happening outside.
If I could just add one other question, I'm rather than type it. First and foremost, great conversation. From an Indigenous point of view, the involvement of extended family or aunties or this type of stuff, how has that been working, especially in, say, your experience in the West Coast of Canada? In Newfoundland, that just is not there yet. Mm-hmm. So how is that type of thing heading, or how is it heading?
I hear you. I wish Heidi was here. She's Indigenous to respond to that question, but just being a parent of children in school and being a close observer of schools, and Megan, maybe you can speak to that. This is something we want to see come in the future. There still seems to me to be quite a barrier between schools and community in that way, but it's a work in progress. Megan, did you want to add something? Unmute and add something.
Yeah, I mean, in Delta, we're quite lucky. We have a really great Indigenous Education department who does a lot to support us in terms of coming for classroom visits, or if we have specific questions or specific requests, or we're learning about something that we don't feel like we have enough knowledge about, they'll come and support us. And they put a lot of their things online. That's been one of the, I guess, gifts of COVID, is that a lot of it is accessible that way. But yeah, it's difficult for sure.
Have you found, I guess like more personally, like I'm teaching grade 8 now, and it's, we have a forest nearby and we go out and it's just play. But we've been doing in science and learning about cells and roots and like photosynthesis and that whole piece. And I've been trying to figure out how to, switch it, but there's a role in play too, but there's also like, would you recommend kind of in teaching to take students to a different space, or how would you start kind of introducing those, a different way of approaching outdoor learning, say?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, every educator will maybe respond differently to this. For me, I think it also depends on the imaginative context that you've set. If you're heading out into a place with an idea that they're going to explore openly, then they might have a less structured approach. But if you've sort of suggested that they are insect detectives, and their job is to, without harming, they're supposed to find 2 things that are flora, 2 things that are fauna. What do those terms mean? How do we know the difference between this, this, this? They're detectives, there's looking for evidence. I mean, there's lots of ways to frame it. But you could put an imaginative spin and an intention. I think is very important that we have an intention to the activity. I fully agree with you. That open play is very important, but we also, and I know that not everybody agrees with this, I think that as educators, it is our role to have an intention and to be guiding in the ways we have students understand things, because at a certain point, we do know more about the topics than they do. And to evoke wonder, we need to give students, they need knowledge to be one, they need to know about moss to really dig in and love moss. So there's a place for us to be directive in some ways, but the ways we are directive should be through storied forms. It should be through ways that engage their emotions, that engage their imaginations, that motivate them to sort of interact with the environment in a unique way. So in your case, if you have a specific concept or something you'd like to teach them about, is there a way that they can discover some aspect of it through inquiry or exploration, and then you can debrief it when they're out there or back in the classroom, but it's just a bit more intentional is what I'm suggesting. Maybe Megan Zenny, do you have something you'd add to that too? I'm totally putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I think play is enough. I think play is a really valuable form of teaching, but I don't disagree with Jillian when she says the intentionality is important. So typically, if you're coming out with a play-based perspective, what we'll usually do is anchor it in story. So either that's an oral story or a text that we're using to kind of anchor something. So if you're noticing roots or trees or something in the natural environment that you want to draw their attention to, there's almost always a book for that, right? Or there's a story that you can tell. And then we start with the intentionality of the circle. This is what we're going to do, but then we're really open to where it goes. And then the closing circle is where we're going to sort of scaffold on what they've done and sort of layer for what's going to happen next. I don't know if that helps, but there is some scaffolding to it for sure, like Jillian said. But I do also come from a like play is learning, play is enough perspective. But as they get older and ask more questions, you do need to be intentional in how you scaffold that for kids.
I do get that feedback from secondary school educators who have a very particular chemistry curriculum that they're wanting to get through. So how do I teach this particular concept? And some say, well, I can't teach every concept outside. Okay, then don't. But you can certainly teach far more through exploration. And I would call that play. It just looks different for older kids.
That's a good point. I like the idea of you have to teach to have wonder. Like you need a little bit of knowledge to be curious about things. You can't just go like, what do you see here? You know, and then adding that scaffolding is kind of, well, do you notice this? And do you know, and building that up. Yeah. I've noticed that. So I like that you like said that's a
I just read the same
thing.
thing. Yes, I've known it for a while just through my research, but then Brene Brown and Atlas of the Heart, curiosity. Yeah. If you want to be curious about something, the more we know, the more we develop that curiosity. It's hard to know what we don't know or what questions to ask without some knowledge. So we can't just, we really want to know the different types of ferns. We really want to know the names and features of different kinds of mosses and soils and everything, because that just feeds our ability to imagine. I know there's a belief that the imagination is completely limitless, and I would disagree with that. Imagination is limited in some ways by what we know. The more we know about the world, the more we can imagine about it. The more we know about nature, the more we connect with it, the more we can imagine, the more opportunities we have to engage our imaginations. I think we've gone over time. I'm sorry, Genevieve. Addie.
No, it's all good. No, it's we have a question from Irene. Megan Sandham mentioned a couple of ipsa.org and c2c.bc.org as some good networks in BC here for outdoor teachers. Irene is wondering, how can I get both the walking curriculum and walking forward resource to read and incorporate into the Abbey Gardens programs?
A great place to get both. I mean, you can get both through me, but you can get both through through the Outdoor Learning Store. And the Outdoor Learning Store is a nonprofit that feeds money back into different organizations. So the Outdoor Learning Store, I think it's .com or .ca. It has the walking curriculum in French and English, and it also then has the resource Walking Forward, which is provided as well. And if you have any trouble at all, you can email me. I'm going to throw my email in here as well.
Just put the link to the walking curriculum book, the English version, in the chat here.
Merci.
Were there any other questions about the resource or kind of how to start doing this?
I do want to put a shout out again to Heidi Wood. I wish she was here. She is the main author on this resource. I've learned an immense amount from her. She's the one who guided all of the inquiry projects. So this is a shame she wasn't here today, but she could maybe follow up if people had additional questions for her. Yes, that's true.
Oh, I was just going to say that Heidi and you did a really wonderful webinar.
Yeah, we just did one, and so you can go to the Outdoor Learning Store and look at their resources, their recordings. As Megan said, they have a ton of excellent webinars, free series, and we recently introduced this resource in a lot more detail, and you could hear from Heidi if you looked at that recording.
We are also doing a giveaway of it, so if you stay till the end, then maybe you can, Irene, win the book. And chances are pretty good right now, so. Lovely. Were there any other questions? Or we can go over kind of the themes that came out. I went to the website and it was really wonderful to, Jillian, how you mentioned that the walks kind of naturally fell into the First People's Principles of Learning. And some of the themes of the learning. So that learning takes place as an emphasis on relationships. It's holistic, it's significant to our own identity, and it recognizes the role of Indigenous knowledge. So these were, correct me if I'm wrong, that these were kind of the 4 themes of the Walking Forward resource. Oh, sorry, you're just muted.
I think I'd figure that out. It's been so long, too long.
I know, I did it this morning too, and I was like, it's been 2 years.
So, well, those are some of them, but we have really tried to incorporate all of the principles of learning in different walks in the book, depending on whether they're paired up with what kind of inquiry. So it's all interwoven.
Which is knowledge and place and all of these things. All overlapping.